my client, Mr. Khan, we were able to negotiate a guilty plea whereby he agreed to enter his plea pursuant to a long stipulation of fact that provided the clarity and the modicum of closure that we think is appropriate for the victims of these terrorist acts. So in that respect, through negotiating a guilty plea, we were able to achieve some measure of clarity and closure for the victims. In terms of his torture, it was years of negotiation with the government, at its height this year, preceding his sentencing, to enable him to give an unsworn statement that described what he was subjected to at the hands of the CIA. And for him, that was very important. And for the country, it's very important to have the measure of accountability that can bring about.
Mr. Chairman, I'm over my time, but I want to thank you for holding this hearing and for the attention that you're giving to the Department of Justice. A lot of this began, as you know, with completely inappropriate opinions offered by the Office of Legal Counsel. How do we know they were inappropriate? Because once they were public, the Department of Justice itself, under the same administration, disavowed them. And that was, in some respects, the original sin. And I don't think we've yet solved the problems at OLC that keep that original sin from repeating itself. And we're in active conversation about that, as you know. But thank you for your leadership, making sure that the Department of Justice doesn't get abused that way again.
I don't know if I'll be here 8 years from now. Maybe somebody else can take on that responsibility. But 8 years ago, we raised this question. And had we closed Guantanamo at that point, I think would be better off as a nation. Senator Cornyn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Obviously, if this were easy, 4 presidents, 20 years, we would have figured this out. But what was unprecedented was the terrorist attack that occurred on our soil that took the lives of 3,000 Americans, and the American people demanded a response. And the American people demanded that we stop future terrorist attacks. But I think part and parcel of the confusion here is we still have people arguing that this should be subject to the usual rules in a criminal trial. And for obvious reasons, that's not possible for many of them. Don't take my word for it, it's what the Obama Commission concluded in 2010. But just, Mr. Jeffrey, you alluded to this, but can you talk about we all agree that the rule of law should apply here, but can you talk about why the rule of law applies differently to a non-citizen captured in the battlefield during a war?
Absolutely. Thank you, Senator Cornyn. The Supreme Court has held that in an ongoing conflict, the United States can hold enemy combatants for the duration of the conflict. Now, there are debates today about with the war on the battlefield in Afghanistan having come to an end with our precipitous withdrawal. Does that change things? The answer clearly is no. Joint Chiefs Chairman Mark Milley and CENTCOM Commander General McKenzie both testified here in the Senate less than 2 months ago that, in fact, the war on terror continues. And our enemies believe the war on terror continues. They continue to plot attacks, both here in the United States and against us and our allies around the globe. And so the war continues, and therefore the ability to detain continues. As Senator Graham correctly pointed out, if we have the ability to kill an enemy on the battlefield, is it not more humane to actually capture them and detain them, even though that detention may be indefinite? How can it be that we have the authority in an ongoing conflict to kill an enemy but not detain them for any amount of time? It simply doesn't make sense to me, and as a result, we have to assess these Gitmo detainees in the context of whether we're going to be able to detain them for a long period.
And that's essentially the ruling of the United States Supreme Court in the Hamdi cases and other cases. Is that correct?
That's correct. The plurality in Hamdi plus Justice Thomas's view in Hamdi. Yes, sir.
What I'm trying to understand is what is being asked for here when people say they want to close Guantanamo in terms of the outcome for the families who lost loved ones on 9/11. Because I heard Mr. Stinson, you and Mr. Jeffer talk about the difficulties of prosecuting these individuals in a court of law, assuming you chose to do that, could do that, even though clearly the law of war allows indefinite detention, as Mr. Jeffer said, for the duration of hostilities. But it seems to me that there are insurmountable problems with trying to try these detainees in an Article III court. And can you explain, Mr. Stinson, your thinking about that? And also, would simply an acquittal and letting these detainees go and avoid any sort of consequences for their terrorist acts, would that be justice in your opinion?
Senator Cornyn, thank you for your question. The argument about closing Guantanamo among the moral arguments is that if you change the zip code and move them to the United States or elsewhere, it eliminates the original sin, quote unquote. And as Senator Graham pointed out, that if you don't deal legislatively with the issue of whether they can be detained under law of war detention and nothing more in the United States, you really don't change anything but the zip code, because it's clear that our enemy is on the march. They're clearly in power in Afghanistan. And if you change the zip code only and change nothing more and prosecute those who you can in court, then our enemy will simply turn their ire and proxy to the new zip code. And so, to close Guantanamo in a responsible way, you have to deal with the fact that we are at war and that law of war detention is the guiding principle, and that if you can prosecute some that can be prosecuted, do that too, and then transfer the remaining if you can get adequate security assurances from the receiving country, which we haven't really gotten the best security assurances from some of the countries where we sent detainees to. That's the conundrum.
Thank you.
Thanks, Senator Cornyn. Senator Blumenthal?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this hearing.